As part of its mission to preserve the history of anesthesiology, the Wood Library Museum sponsors interviews of people who have made significant contributions to the specialty. Today is July 25th, 1997, and I will be speaking with Joachim Stefan Gravenstein. No one ever calls him that. It's either JS or Nick. We're here in the University of Florida Medical School office where Dr. Gravenstein has spent a good portion of his career, and he currently serves as a graduate research professor. Nick, I wonder if we could start, if you would just tell us a little bit about your early career and how you got into anesthesia.
Okay. I went to medical school at the University of Bonn in Germany, and in Germany there was, and I think still is, the custom of having to do a doctoral dissertation, and mine was on disturbances of spontaneity after frontal lobe trauma. And in those days people talked about frontal lobotomy, and I was going to become a neurosurgeon. And so I took a surgical internship in a Catholic hospital where nuns functioned as scrub nurses and circulating nurses and ran the show. And our chief was the worst that German surgical tradition had to offer. He threw instruments and he cursed, and it was so bad that the scrub nurse, who was a superb technical scrub nurse, nun, would have a sterile beaker on the Mayo stand with rolled sponges, and when the surgeon started, and I'm not going to mention his name even though he's deceased, when the surgeon started to throw instruments and curse in sacrilegious manners, she would cry. And then the tears would roll down her cheek, and this, of course, would contaminate things. So she had a Kelly clamp, and she would then grab one of those rolled sponges and dab her tears and dispose of the sponge. And this is where I first observed anesthesia, which, as a matter of course, was given by nurses, nuns. The routine was an Avatine tribomethanol induction rectal installation, and then open drop ether. And then every now and then we had a private patient, and there were two categories of them. Sometimes we used Evipal, intravenous, sort of forerunner to thiopental, and this was given intravenously, and then one of us interns would be delegated to administer this, and we would take the patient's arm out, and we would sit at the patient's side so that we could put the needle with the syringe into the antecubital vein and inject it. And this was thought to be even good for abdominal procedures. It was awful. Of course, you can imagine exactly what happened. Of course, we didn't monitor oxygenation, we didn't monitor blood pressure, we did look at ventilation, and if they turned blue or stopped breathing, we knew that that we had overdosed or something like this. These were very, very uncomfortable procedures. And then every now and then we had a specially private patient, and then the surgeon would come and pick one of his surgical residents, and he would say, "You are going to do the anesthetic tomorrow, and you're going to use the machine." And the machine was sitting in the corridor, covered with a white blanket. And this poor resident then had to go out and look at the machine. And if he was conscientious, he might have looked at a textbook of pharmacology where he might have found a paragraph this short on anesthesia and nitrous oxide. Now you realize that there's plenty of oxygen in nitrous oxide. It's N2O. So he would then go ahead and give nitrous oxide, maybe with a little bit of oxygen. And invariably, the patient would then turn blue, which our surgical chief then observed, and he then announced, being a professor, that clearly the patient was allergic to nitrous oxide. And we had to stop this and had to switch over to ether anesthesia, which was given safely by the nurses. Those were my early experiences. And the attitude was, of course, this was a nursing function. Nobody else did it. So one would never dream of making this a medical specialty.
Were there attendings present for this, or was it just nurses that were doing this, or
for anesthesia?
For anesthesia,
absolutely.
Right.
I mean, well, let me just tell you. So one day I saw an article in one of the German medical journals on anesthesia, the first one I'd ever seen, and I found this quite interesting. All the things, I forget now what he said, but whatever it was fascinated me. So I went to see this surgical chief, and I remember this to this day, which is quite a few years ago. He sat behind his desk, and when I asked him about career in anesthesia, he tilted his chair back like this, and he slapped his thighs like that, and he said that was the funniest question that he had ever had. Anesthesia was clearly a specialty for nurses, and if there was any problem, why, there was always a surgeon available to take care of it. And it was only in England where people were silly enough to waste good talent of physicians on this ridiculous specialty. I don't know whether it was on the same day or a few days later that I wrote to one of the programs that had been mentioned there, applying for a residency. Not the most mature response and the mature reason for going into anesthesia, but anyway, that's got me started.
Yes. Now, you went from there to
Basel in Switzerland,
and
where Hugin, Werner Hugin, was the chief of anesthesia, and he had spent, I think, a year in Boston at the MGH with Beecher, and had then established one of the first training programs in anesthesia. We had a wonderful time. There were 2 residents. Beecher himself was still quite young. He must have been in his mid-30s or so. And 6 or 7 nurses. All the intubations had to be done by us physicians. The nurses weren't supposed to intubate. And blocks and things like that, spinal, all of this was done by physicians. And then in the afternoon, he would invite us to have a sweet roll and a cup of coffee, and we would talk about anesthesia problems and pharmacology and physiology and so on and so forth. The sort of graduate training that you would dream about at the University of Basel.
It sounds more like an education program than a training program.
That's a fine distinction,
Yes.
and this, of course, is what one would hope to have. And nowadays we're having a tough time to keeping that distinction.
Are these things that he brought from the training program at MGH to Basel, or is this something he had developed himself?
I think that's something that he developed himself. He was a very good clinician, and he had, all important people have little weaknesses, and his weakness was that he thought that surgery was eventually going to disappear because the question of cancer was going to be resolved. And so he maintained on weekends a general practice in one of the little cities in the area where he saw patients, because he thought that within his lifetime anesthesia was going to become unnecessary.
How long did you stay in Basel?
About a year and a half.
And then on to Boston after that, is that?
And then on to Boston, yeah. Beecher came to visit in Basel, the big man, and he then invited me to come to Boston to continue my training, which I did.
What was the character of the training in at MGH at that time?
It was training rather than education. We had long clinical days, including Saturdays, miserably paid. I remember as a first-year resident, we had so little money that I took food home from the cafeteria. The residents and interns were offered free food. So I stuffed my pockets and took it home to supplement the diet of my family. We had 2 kids by then. And we didn't have scrub suits. So I found out that the soft-boiled eggs at the MGH were so soft-boiled that we could scramble them at home. So I would stick soft-boiled eggs into my pocket. And then there was an emergency, something like this, and you had to run up into the operating room. No scrub suits, so you still wore your white uniform. And then you would lean over a table or an anesthesia machine, and then suddenly it would go, and then one of the eggs had broken, and then you would feel this warm, soft stuff running down your legs.
Who else was there at the time in the program?
John Bunker, who was later at Stanford, Nick Green, who was at Yale, Rochester first and Yale, Phipps Hallowell, Don Todd, and I'm sure there are several others. And then later on, Mike Laver, who then was in Boston, and Henning Pontoppidan, who stayed at the MGH, and Hendrik Bendixen, who was in Columbia, at Columbia University.
Well, it's quite a group of people. I'm wondering what Beecher did that turned so many of these people on to academic anesthesia. Is there anything you can identify that?
Well, the interesting thing is, and it's somewhat disturbing, is that it wasn't clinical anesthesia that turned people on, because he himself was not a what he would have called a deft clinician. He gave anesthesia at the Phillips House, which is the private hospital at the MGH complex, fee-for-service, which he needed to boost his income. And every now and then we did what Medicare would frown upon, namely relieve him, many years ago. And invariably you would find his patients pickled in ether with dilated pupils and barely breathing. But ether was such a forgiving drug, and we knew that when we took over from the chief, all you had to do was turn off. He had 2 bubble vaporizers in series, and you turned everything off and just gave oxygen for the next hour and a half until the surgeon was done, and then the patient would eventually wake up again.
Were there conferences and so forth too? Was it
well, okay, come to think of it, Huygens may have been influenced by Beecher, because Beecher also had a coffee hour where people were invited to wander into his office and talk about anything under the sun. The formal program of lectures I don't recall as being particularly memorable. This is sort of a stating it twice. You know, I don't recall, and it's not particularly memorable.
Yeah, right. But the informal conferences were
the informal conferences were interesting and wide-ranging, and on a level beyond the day-to-day clinical problems that confront the residents from a technical point of view.
So bringing in physiology and pharmacology.
Bringing physiology and discussing concerns about human experimentation, for example, and pharmacology issues in current thinking about pharmacology. Beecher, of course, was very much involved in what he called the subjective response, which had to do with how people reacted to narcotics, which Beecher saw as not merely taking care of pain, being analgesics, but also changing the attitude of patients toward their pain and their affliction. he had made the observation repeated many, many times when he was a military physician and anesthetist in Italy, that the wounded required less morphine than their injuries would suggest, and less than comparative injuries in civilian accidents, for example, would require.
Yes. This is a very famous study that you're referring to. It sounds as if all the things that he was involved when he was passing on to the people were in his program.
I think so. Maybe I'm more aware of it because I did some research there with him and got involved in these things and became a fellow and participated in some of the studies on analgesics. And I remember we used heroin and did studies on analgesic effectiveness and respiratory depression and psychological effects. And then he thought that this concept of the subjective response was relevant not only for pain, but for other problems as well. For example, cough. You know, I mean, all the narcotics are good antitussives. So I spent, I don't know, uncounted hours and days in a TB sanitarium early in the morning when these patients woke up, and of course the first thing they had to do was cough. And then we gave them codeine and placebos to see what it did and whether or not there was also a subjective component to that.
How long did you stay at Harvard?
I got there in 1952, and I left, well, in 1956 I went back to medical school and repeated years 3 and 4 at Harvard Medical School, even though I had been licensed to practice medicine in Massachusetts.
I was going to say this was not remedial work then. It was a...
Well, you could call it remedial because I was aware of the fact that my medical education in Germany left much to be desired. When I went to medical school in Bonn, the buildings were destroyed, many of the professors had not come back, and then during the 1,000-year Reich, science had suffered severely.
Yes.
And when I now read some of the papers that were published under the Hitler regime, I just shake my head in disbelief that anybody would have accepted that sort of.
So shortly after you finished medical school that you came to Florida to take over the program here. Is that...
As a matter of fact, I was still a medical student when I was appointed chief here.
That's a very rapid rise. That's a...
Very rapid rise, yes. But of course the nice thing was that it was a brand new medical school. There were no patients yet. The hospital hadn't been opened. And we were all young. Even the dean was young. And I also remember that when I left to be interviewed here, taking off from my 4th-year medical student duties, my colleagues in Boston urged me to insist on an independent department, independent from surgery. So I remember vividly that I met with Dean Harrell, a very idealistic dean here in the new medical school, and I told him this, Dr. Harrell, the one thing I have to insist on is departmental status for anesthesia. And he had the habit of paring his nails with a razor blade while he talked with you. So he sat there and doing this to his nails. I admire him. I mean, he was a wonderful dean. And he looked at me and he said, well, Dr. Gravenstein, exactly how big is your department? And I had to admit that it was just a one-man department since I had to start out with it. And we then agreed that I might start as a division of surgery until we had established more than just one person in the department.
Well, anesthesia was just beginning to take off. This would have been about 1958.
1958, right.
Not many teaching programs in anesthesia at that point, very few anesthesiologists. What kind of problems did you encounter here in setting up a department?
Well, I'm not so sure that there were all that few anesthesia departments. There were quite a few around. Certainly the well-known ones in Boston, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, San Diego. I'm not sure about San Diego, but certainly the Madison, Wisconsin, not to be forgotten. Philadelphia, my goodness, I almost forgot that one. And others, I'm sure. Anesthesia as a specialty, I think, was accepted, even though if you compare the attitude of medical schools and surgeons toward anesthesia between now and then, we have gained an awful lot of ground. But in the early days of anesthesia, it was considered to be very low on the pecking order, the academic pecking order. It was a service specialty, and to the credit of many investigators in these excellent departments in the United States, anesthesia slowly gained a reputation, and it became more and more sophisticated. And I think at a certain point in many departments there was more research going on in anesthesia than in the surgical parent department. The trend to establishing independent status for anesthesia, departmental status, was just beginning at that time. So,
did you have trouble getting research support here, brand new department? How did you get that started? I know it was successful, but how did you go about doing that?
Well, I think we started we had a little bit of money. The whole financial structure of the department was quite different from what it is now. For example, the fee for service charged was a percentage of the surgical fee. So we charged 20% of the surgical fee. This was our income. And then the relative value guides came in and we switched over to that, and it was possible to keep some of the fee-for-service income, since we were essentially salaried, for research. And then we were successful in getting grant support, which, to the credit of people like Manny Papper and Bob Dripps, was being made available through the NIH, recognizing that research in anesthesia was important.
This would be in the 60s then? This was
early
beginning
60s.
to develop? Yes, yes. One of the other things you did here, I think, was start a physician assistant program. Is that right? Or is
no, no, I didn't. We started a training program for nurses, which caused me all sorts of grief, because my colleagues in the state of Florida thought that this was absolutely awful. And the reason for starting it is there weren't enough young physicians interested in going into anesthesia. We had a tough time covering the schedule. And the requirement for anesthesia services throughout the state and elsewhere was very strong. People wanted to have both nurse anesthetists and anesthesiologists. So I started a program for nurse anesthetists, to the displeasure of the society, the Florida Anesthesia Society, who at a meeting that is also unforgettable censored me. And I was given an opportunity to explain why I did this, and I presented the statistics as they were available, showing that we were going to be in need of nurse anesthetists one way or the other, and that we couldn't hope to close the gap between the manpower requirements in the specialty, and that therefore it was sensible, reasonable, and responsible to start a training program. But this was not accepted, and they voted a formal censure of myself, and they threatened to expel members of the faculty here at the University of Florida from the Florida society if they were in support of what I was doing.
The program did continue. I know in 1969 when I came here, it was still going.
Yeah, and Jerry Modell continued it for several years. And then in the mid-'80s, I don't know exactly when, but when I came back to Florida, the training program was still going. And then, of course, we had the wonderful time of having enough young physicians applying to get into anesthesia. And the fortunes of anesthesia had changed dramatically because some of the best graduates of medical schools went into anesthesia.
Now, when you say you left, that was to Case Western Reserve in Cleveland. And what was the nature of the program you started up there, and what were your goals up there?
Well, my interest even then was in technology in anesthesia. And at Case Western Reserve, they had a very active biomedical engineering program with interests in working with anesthesia. I had a difficult time establishing this at the University of Florida. And in addition to this, I had the feeling that we had plateaued, and I wasn't really able to push it the next level up, which Modell did superbly well, taking over here. So I went to Case Western Reserve, and there was the first chairman of an independent department. Up until then, they had also had a division of anesthesia in the surgical department.
And you established some ties with the biomedical department while you were there?
Very intimate,
yes.
And we had a number of people who did their master's or PhD degrees in work related to anesthesia with the biomedical engineering group.
Did you have a background in engineering, or is this something that you were interested in and then just picked up?
This is like being a critic. You know, if you don't know anything about it, then you write about it.
And that works.
So I don't have a background in engineering, but I've always admired them, and to my friends in engineering, I always say that if I had only been better in math, I would have become an engineer. But lacking that skill, I had to go into medicine.
This sounds a little bit like a theme. You mentioned in Basel that the monitoring was very crude. Was that, do you think that was the beginning of your interest in monitoring in bioengineering?
The monitoring in Bonn was very crude. In Basel, we were already keeping records and checking blood pressure and heart rate and respiratory rate. That's as far as it went. And then in Gainesville, we began to do a little more with some invasive monitoring and, radial catheters or Cunard needles came into use, and capnography began to appear.
What were your goals when you first started in the biomedical engineering? What were you trying to accomplish?
I had the idea that the challenge the challenge or the influence of anesthesia having cardiovascular and autonomic and respiratory effects would allow you to make statements about the patient's health status. And I even thought that perhaps taking cues from the patient's response to a given dose of thiopental or halothane or ether, whatever, would allow you to make a statement about the patient's cardiovascular well-being, for example. This hasn't really panned out. We've tried it, and we even were funded for this, but it was very difficult to do because there are too many variables in this.
And you had the bioengineers working on this problem as well?
And then we, simultaneously, we got involved into monitoring, and I think at Case Western Reserve we had one of the first automated record-keeping systems going in the mid-'70s. And I got involved in telemedicine. We established a link via a laser beam with modulated frequencies from the university hospital to an inner city hospital. and made available consultation via this link. So we had, for instance, we made rounds in the intensive care unit of this community hospital. They didn't have an intensivist. And Betty Grundy was one of the people who sat on our side of this laser link and made rounds in the intensive care unit. We also had it in the operating room, where we made our expertise available to our colleagues and frequently nurses on the other side in this little community hospital.
What was the nature of the ties you had with the bioengineering department there, biomedical engineering department there? Did you have people in your department, for example, who were bioengineers, or how did you set that up?
Eventually we did. At the beginning, of course, this is not something you can do overnight. But we eventually had Howard Apple, a PhD, who got his PhD in biomedical engineering at Case, to join the department as our engineer. And I visited them and they visited us, and this development of systolic time intervals, for example, we did, and the data capture, monitoring signals and capturing them for future analysis. All of this required engineering expertise, which I did not have. And we were successful in getting some grant support for this from the Public Health Service, so that this was...
Were the equipment makers interested in this also?
Yes, even though to a lesser degree. I think that the primary support was federal funding.
Now, you've continued ties. Since you've returned to Gainesville, you've developed ties with the, I think it's the University of Eindhoven, is that?
Yeah. We also ran some workshops to which we invited industry, sent participants, and of course academe was represented. And one of the people who participated in this was Jan Beneken from the University of Eindhoven, where he was professor of, I think, officially electrical engineering, but he was responsible for the biomedical engineering activities, and he had a division of biomedical engineering. He was famous as one of the, or maybe the first person to do some modeling of the cardiovascular system.
And this developed eventually into computer simulation, patient simulation, is that right?
The modeling, of course, is an integral part of simulation. And Beneken and his disciples played a very important role in doing that here in Gainesville.
And when did you get the idea of using this for teaching, computer simulation?
I think that the credit for this really, and much of the initiative goes to Mike Good, who came to me and complained that he thought it was awful to throw people into the operating room and sort of tell them sink or swim without having had a chance to practice these things. And out of his interest and whatever support I could give, the simulation project blossomed here in Gainesville.
And this has now become a commercial, corporations are taking this up and...
Very successful, yeah. There were, of course, two teams that got into the simulation business. At Palo Alto with Dave Garber, who independently and simultaneously developed this concept, and then here in Gainesville.
Did the two groups work together at all, or was this quite independent?
Well, no, it was independent. And of course, we think that our system is much, much better than the Stanford system. And I suspect that the Stanford people think that their system is much, much better than the Gainesville system.
That could be. Now, you've been involved in Patient Safety Foundation too, is that
right?
Correct? How did that come about? Through your work with monitoring and bioengineering?
Not really. I think it happened because G. Pierce, who had stepped down as president of the ASA after having served his term, was interested in establishing this, and he invited me to participate. You would have to ask him why he hit upon me. I don't know. But from the outset, I was a member of the of the executive committee of the Patient Safety Foundation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Helped it along.
Mm-hmm. Another area I wanted to ask about was, I think, the physician assistant program. You did develop that in Cleveland.
At Case Western Reserve.
Yeah, you were very busy developing programs up there. Can you tell me something about that?
Yeah, this is one of the other controversial things I've done. My feeling, having watched the nurses in Gainesville work, some of them superb, absolutely first-class clinical anesthetists, and running educational programs for nurses who had been out in practice and were clamoring for some continued education. And people came to me and said, you know, I work with this surgeon every day. I know more physiology than he does, or she does. No, it was usually a he does.
Usually he, yes.
And then they asked, what would it take for me to become a physician? And then I sat down with them and went over their educational background, and it invariably turned out that if they had college, it was inadequate preparation for medical school because the courses they had taken wouldn't get them into medical school. And so finally the concept grew that ideally you'd like to have a team in which your helpers are not stuck in the level of their expertise, but have an option of growing into the next higher and more demanding profession. And so the idea was, why not introduce the anesthesia concept in college, either at the baccalaureate level or at the master's degree level, as is done at Emory, and put into the courses they take in college enough to satisfy the requirements of a medical school, and use some of the time that is available to introduce them so that they can become physician's assistant in anesthesia. I found this, and I continue to find it, such an attractive concept, and I think it's very difficult to argue against it on an intellectual level and on an educational level. There are all sorts of arguments on a political level against it. So that's what we started, a program which Case Western Reserve accepted.
So they supported it, the university supported the development of this?
The university supported it.
And which branch of the university did you work with to start this?
This was on the college level. I'm not quite sure exactly what branch it was, but it was a baccalaureate degree in the health sciences.
And you recruited undergraduates to this?
We didn't even have to go out recruit. It was just announced, and people flocked to it. And,
really?
they didn't have to go on to do anesthesia. They could take this and do something else. So the surgeons became interested in this and thought something similar could be done in surgery.
Who was teaching the students then?
We did.
Your faculty was teaching the students. And teaching them anatomy and physiology and basic science and
on a level which we thought would be appropriate for a baccalaureate degree. I mean, you don't want to anticipate anatomy lessons in the first year of medical school. And to give them a feel for medicine and for the healthcare system, to introduce this conceptually, on which you can then build the anesthesia specialty on a more technical level, with the expectation that they would then go to medical school. And I had the hope, not a realistic one as it turned out, that the American board would eventually say that sort of preparation is worth something. So if you've gone through this and then gone to medical school, you might be able to shorten your residency training program a little bit. But even if that didn't work, I still think that it was a worthwhile effort.
Were you the only one working on this at this time, or were there others that were other places that
John
were...
Steinhaus at Emory was the only other person who worked on it. And he emphasized this on the master's degree level, and I don't think that really makes all that much difference.
You said this was controversial. Where was the controversy? Where were you meeting resistance?
The nurse anesthetists, even though they should think of me as a friend, were quite upset because they viewed that as a competition with nurse anesthesia. I don't know whether or not our emphasis on the baccalaureate education, college education, for people going into anesthesia on that level influenced the American Association of Nurse Anesthetists to push for baccalaureate degree in their training programs or educational programs and master's degrees.
What was the response of the ASA?
Mixed. There, I think there was more opposition than support. I am not a politician at all, so the political battles, I think, were primarily fought. Maybe that's too harsh a word. I mean, the politics of it was primarily done by John Steinhaus, who was a consummate ex-ASA president. He understands the system and was able to work with it much better than I could.
Just going back to your students, from the classroom, how did you start to work them into clinical anesthesia then? Did you just take them in the operating room and...
We farmed them out to anesthesiologists in the community, primarily, to become familiar with the system and to learn how to be of help and how to monitor. And the concept was that they would always work in a team with anesthesiologists. The nurses, of course, nurse anesthetists, frequently work not within a team. I don't know how frequently, but that certainly is something that the American Society has been opposed to.
And what were their responsibilities in the operating room?
Well, preparing everything, preparing the patient, doing the technical things such as starting IVs and getting baseline data, monitoring once the anesthetic was stable was quite acceptable. So it's on that level, to allow one anesthesiologist also to do more than one case simultaneously.
I see, yeah. Is that program still going on in Case Western?
You know, I don't even know that. Even though I was there recently, I haven't checked on this. I know that at Emory it's still going on very actively.
Is there a certification for these now? Too? So,
there's a certification process which is nationally recognized. Of course, many states deal with this differently. So the graduates of these programs have to work within the state system. And I understand that in some states they cannot be hired, and in other states it works perfectly fine.
There's another area I'd like to explore a little bit. I think the first time I ever saw you or heard you, you came as a visiting professor to the University of Virginia, where I was a resident. And I remember you're talking about Paracelsus. And I wasn't sure if that was a person or a thing at that point, and I've since learned. When did you start to get interested in medical history and anesthesia history?
Well, I just first have to tell you about Paracelsus. I gave a talk on Paracelsus somewhere at a state meeting, and the colleague who introduced me said, mistook this for paregoric.
Which was appropriate, I guess, considering his interest.
And so he talked about my interest in paregoric and pharmacology of the drug, and then he turned me loose to discuss Paracelsus. I don't know when that started. It's something that has interested me just as a sideline as long as I've been in medicine. I've read about it, and I once bought a little book on Paracelsus, who was also in Basel, where he did some book burning in his days.
He did book burning, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, doing away with some of the things that he thought were completely wrong and not supported by experience and experiments.
Mm-hmm. And you've also looked a little bit into hospital design and some of the words associated with anesthesia and breathing and life, I think.
Yeah, I was interested in, and once again, I don't know where that started, but the point that we always run into is that we deal with respiration, mm-hmm. and having had a, if abbreviated, nevertheless sort of the rudiments of a classic education in Germany. Spiritus, which is the part of the respiration, is of course Latin and means the ghost or the breath. Mm-hmm. And from there on you can look into these connections, and respiration, inspiration, you take up the ghost. Mm-hmm. Expiration, when you give up the ghost. Mm-hmm. Expire, exhale. Animated, anima, wind, breath, mm-hmm. soul, living being. And then it turns out that in all sorts of other languages you find similar connections. So the idea of this concept of breathing having to do with the spirits is a very old one in mankind.
Now you also served for a time as a trustee of the Wood Library Museum.
Right.
I think. And how did your involvement in that start?
I have no idea. Somebody must have recommended me. I forget who recommended me, mm-hmm. but it must have been because of some of the historical papers I've published.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I should probably also mention that even though we've interviewed many people for this series, I'm probably the only one to interview someone who started a dynasty in anesthesia. I think it's fair to mention that your son is upcoming chairman at the University of Florida, and you have one other son on the faculty here. Are there others in your family that are involved in anesthesia as well as this?
We are working on it, but they are yet too small.
So this is genetic engineering, is that right?
The grandchildren, there are still hopes for them, but so far not. Yeah. We have one other physician in the family who is an internist and professor of internal medicine, and we have a veterinarian, and that's all I can contribute to medicine.
Yes. Well, I think this concludes my questions. Do you have any other area that...
Well, I look at anesthesia with a little bit of concern because it needs to defend itself now because of the cutbacks in funding and the temptation to declare anesthesia has done its thing, it's now safe. We have a mortality rate which is almost too small to measure, like 1 in 100,000 or so, 1 in 200,000 even. And so the temptation to push anesthesia into, you put him asleep and wake him up and don't bother us otherwise, I think exists and is potentially very harmful, not only to the specialty as such, but also to the patients in the long run. I think there is now also within the Anesthesia Patient Safety Foundation a concern that safety is taking a back position in all the decisions that are being made in medicine. It's so difficult to measure these things. If you, and the point I like to make is, if you are an absolutely rotten, lousy, awful, corner-cutting, irresponsible anesthesiologist or nurse anesthetist, and you work for 30 years in your specialty, and you do 1,000 cases a year, and at the end of your 30 years, you could say, I haven't killed a single person, and you may be right. But if you had 100 of such lousy, rotten, poor anesthesiologists, their mortality rate might be 2 or 3 times of what you would find the mortality rate being in somebody who is very conscientious and highly skilled and well-informed and so on and so forth. The reason, of course, is that if it's true that our mortality rate, preventable mortality, is 1 in 100,000, if you just do 30,000 cases, you may not run into it.
How do you think we should deal with this?
Well, I think the most important thing is to collect data, to document what is actually going on, and we have not been successful in doing this in the United States because of our concern with lawsuits. In Great Britain and particularly in Australia, they are far more successful in doing this. And once we have the data, I think we could make the point that something needs to be done.
It sounds as if you think part of this is also our relationship with the public. Is that?
It is. Anesthesia is a very quiet specialty, and every time some big event, surgical event, as we recently had in Gainesville, anesthesiologist is not even mentioned. Mm-hmm. Which I think is fine. You know, we should be modest, and all of this is okay. And we don't want to go around making people afraid of anesthesia. And this is the other side of the coin.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And our relationship with the surgeons, do you think that's a contributing factor now too?
Well, our relationship with surgeons is so much better than it was in years gone by. There's just no comparison.
We've made progress since your first encounter as a medical student.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Oh, and I had, over the years, I've had other encounters with surgeons. I remember our first chief of thoracic surgery here in this institution, 1958. He had been in the Air Force, American Air Force, flying bomber missions over Europe. I had been in the German Navy as a corpsman. And at one point, he got so exasperated with me for not wanting to do what he wanted me to do, that he said, "I wish I'd hit you with one of my bombs." Well, eventually we got along quite well.
Yeah. One other question I'd like to ask. Your English is wonderful, and your written English is wonderful, too. And how did you develop that facility? I've read your papers and enjoyed them, and you've got a wonderful way of writing and with words.
Well, thank you. I had spent a year as a boy in the United States, in Cincinnati and in Woodstock, Kingston, New York, which got me started on it. I
see, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then just practice after that. So.
Well, and then I came back. Well, I didn't practice during World War II. As a matter of fact, the one time then this really has nothing to do with it, but it's sort of an anecdote. I was a corpsman, as I mentioned, and at one point they brought in British prisoners which were interviewed by some German lieutenant who spoke English reasonably well. And there were two soldiers with whom he couldn't communicate. He couldn't get anything out of them. So somebody knew that I had been in the States and said, could you talk to these guys? So I sat down with them, and not knowing about smoking and those hazards, I offered them a cigarette and just sat and kept quiet. And eventually they started talking with one another in German. And I didn't have to do any translation. And it turned out one of those very, very sad consequences of these awful wars. They had belonged to a German minority in Poland, had been drafted into the German army, had been captured by the British, had been recognized as Poles, had been drafted into the British army as hostile to Germany Poles,
yes.
Had never learned English, and had been captured by the Germans again.
Full circle. Two other things I'd like to bring up. One is we now have at the University of Florida an endowed professorship in your name, and you are holding that?
No, I am not sitting on my own chair.
You're not sitting? Okay.
Not in that sense.
How did that come about?
I think this goes back to both Dr. Modell, who has been chairman for many years here, my successor, and to his successor, Dr. Kuchera, who accumulated in a special fund enough money to eventually endow a chair, and I was greatly honored that they would name this the J.S. Gravenstein Chair.
Yes. Anything else we ought to?
I have an honorary degree. I have 3 MD degrees.
Yes. Well, 3 MD degrees,
Yeah.
yes. Well, from Harvard and...
University of Bonn, and then from Harvard an MD, and then I was awarded an honorary doctorate of medicine from the University of Graz in Austria.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a burden to run around with 3 degrees.
It's a very heavy burden
It's a
indeed.
heavy burden.
It reminds me of the comment that Kennedy made. He said that he was talking about a colleague who had a Yale degree and a Harvard education. He said it was the best of all possible worlds. I think that may be the case here. Good. Okay, thank you.
Okay.